So thanks for coming. Tonight is the fourth event in the What We Talk About When We Talk About Work series of public discussions. And the discussions bring together curators and artists based in the north of the UK with invited speakers from different European cities. And the theme discussions have each been hosted by a Northern Art Gallery and are being live broadcast as well as archived by the contemporary art magazine This Is Tomorrow. So tonight's event takes a theme of fictional encounters, exploring constructs and uses of language within contemporary art, curatorial and archival practices. And unfortunately, Alistair Robinson couldn't join us this evening. He's the director for the Northern Gallery for Contemporary Art. But tonight's topic of fictional encounters arrived from conversations between Alistair and myself and took into consideration some of the past projects here at the gallery. So, although it's clear that I'm not going to be able to relate these projects as well as Alistair could, I'm going to attempt to give it a shot, to give a bit of context for why the theme and why we're talking about this here tonight. So NGCA has previously programmed a series of exhibitions that specifically looked at constructs and uses of language. For example, one of tonight's speakers, George Vasey, developed the group exhibition Emotional Resources whilst he was curator here, and I'm sure he's going to talk about that in some more detail. The show brought together artworks from an international group of artists from the 70s to the present day that shifted between embodied forms of conversation, such as speech and gesture, towards more textual forms of communication. The gallery has also developed projects that looked at the forms of language that political discourse take. So in the shows, Hints to Workmen and Rank, Picturing the Social Order, such discourses were taken as if fiction, that is, as narratives to be unpicked, forms of rhetoric and persuasion. A related project was Think Tank, in which NGCA commissioned graphic and some 3D designers to create speculative adverts for ideas put forward by Westminster think tanks, taking into consideration like a wide political spectrum that would supposedly make the country a better place. So the resulting show was a battle of ideas, rhetoric, and forms of persuasion dramatized as political advertising. So against this backdrop of NGCA's exhibitions exploring language, alongside their ongoing commitment to artist publications, tonight's speakers will each explore language not only as a means to communicate meanings and messages, but as it means, at least momentarily, divorced from discernible ends of communication, affirming, if not actively seeking out, moments of communicative breakdown and dysfunction or malfunction. They seek to dwell in or inhabit the cloudy tonality, rhythm, sound, and pattern of speech, the ambiguity of gesture, and the opaque materiality and form of letters and words. So our first speaker this evening is George Vasey. George has curated a number of exhibitions exploring ideas around intimacy, language, and gesture, including A Small Hiccup, exploring deceased language, emotional resources about the failings and flaws of multiple modes of communication, and These Rotten Words, focusing on the physicality of textual, gestural, and vocal forms of communication. Following George, Sarah Giannini, an independent curator, researcher, writer, and semiotician, joining us from Amsterdam, will talk about her recent projects. Stretching the curatorial beyond the exhibition, her projects take different forms and develop as experimental collaborations with artists, institutions, and practitioners across different fields. In 2006 to 2007, she was a research fellow at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven with the project Can We Talk About Art with the Phasic Tongues, focusing on the collection of the Renée Daniels Foundation. The project investigated the potential of aphasic language and dysfunctional communication to detour archival practices and writing. Our final speaker, Dawn Bothwell, is part of Circa Projects based in Newcastle. Circa Projects is an organisation that collaborates with local and international artists and partners to initiate contemporary art situations rooted in the specific conditions of the northeast of England. Previous Circa projects have included working with artists on text-based performances, publications, and online Twitter residencies. So before everyone gives their presentations, I'll introduce them all in a little more detail. And then following their presentations, there'll be a short discussion and an opportunity for questions with the audience at the end of the evening. But before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone who's made tonight's event, as well as the whole series of talks possible. So the team at NGCA, Raina and James at This Is Tomorrow, and the generous support of Arts Council England, Contemporary Visual Art Network Northwest, Yorkshire and Humberside Visual Art Network, Northeast Contemporary Visual Arts Network, and the participating venues of MIMA, NGCA, Blue Coat, Grundy Art Gallery, the Tetley, and the Whitworth. So, George is a curator and writer. In 2017, he was curator of the Turner Prize at Ferrens Art Gallery in Hull, and he's currently a curatorial fellow at Newcastle University. From 2014 to 2016, he was curator here at NGCA, and his writing has appeared in Art Monthly, Art Review, Frieze, Kaleidoscope, and Moose Magazine. In 2013, he was the writer in residence at Jerwood Space London. And from 2016 to 17, he worked alongside Millie Thompson as lead mentor on Syllabus 2, a peer-led learning programme for 10 artists run by New Contemporaries, Eastside Projects, Wising Art Centre, Studio Voltaire, S1 Art Space, and Spike Island.
So, as Laura said, I define myself as a curator and a writer, which I think is quite important because language is incredibly important to me in terms of it's a space, writing is a space where I think. And I've always tried to work both institutionally but also have an independent voice as a writer, supporting artists in a slightly different way. So what I thought I'd do today is just talk about the projects that Laura mentioned, this kind of trilogy of shows over the last 5 years that I've curated. I never actually saw them as a trilogy of shows when I did my first project, A Small Hiccup, in 2013. But I think increasingly, I've been thinking recently about the idea of what a curatorial practice is. Similarly to an artistic practice, I think it's something that happens when you reflect on what you've been doing for the last 5 or 10 years. And I return to the same kind of questions. Ideas around language, ideas particularly around misunderstanding. I'm very interested in this idea of the comedic trope of misunderstanding, and how we can productively harness ideas of not knowing. So what are the claims that we're making for work? And these are the kind of things that are core to a lot of my curatorial practice. Okay. So I often start with this image when I talk about curating. And I kind of did this thing about a year ago where I thought about, a lot of students were asking me, like, what do I do as a curator? So I often do a series of workshops where we kind of look at the kind of spaces that curators occupy, sort of partially influenced by Richard Serra's verb list. So Richard Serra has this long list of verbs where the different kind of actions that you can kind of enact upon objects. So often people think of the curator historically as someone that advocates for work. There's a kind of gatekeeper that says, this is good work, and I put it in a gallery. And of course, that's a lot of what I do, but I'm also interested in kind of challenging that, or showing up, or kind of calling attention to some of those processes. So as a curator, my main tool is language, both spoken, like I'm speaking in front of you today, but also written in the press release, in the curatorial, in the catalogue, the artist catalogue, or in the funding applications, and how we can use language to claim authority for something, but also use it to kind of undermine or antagonize. You know, often when I show something, I'm not always saying it's good or great art. I'm trying to sort of When, for instance, as a curator working with a collection, you may use language to kind of undermine objects in certain ways, or to kind of call attention to the fact. One thing I'm very interested in is sort of shifting this notion of the third-person institution, this idea the institution speaks as a we, and moving it to a first-person institution to speak in a more informal or personal tone. So things as simple as like writing the wall label in first person, I, to call attention to my own subjectivity, to film the artists introducing their own shows, to film myself talking about the show. I'm often very interested in those things as a way of kind of saying what I'm presenting is partial, subjective, and just my opinion. I'm not trying to create another canon. In some ways, I'm trying to question the canon. So a small hiccup was a project I curated about 5 years ago that was influenced by a low-budget horror film called Pontypool. It's an amazing horror film that was originally made for radio. And basically it's about the English language being diseased. And it's in a little village in Pontypool, which is a predominantly French-speaking part of Canada. So the idea of the English language being somehow viral, and I was very interested at that time in that notion of the minor literary. So Deleuze and Guattari talk about the idea of the minor literature as a way of so a major literature would be English, and a minor literature would be a kind of vernacular that would be kind of a peripheral language that would somehow kind of call attention to kind of something within the mainstream. I was also very interested in William Burroughs' writing on the language as a virus. So I was very interested in this show, looking at ideas of transmission and publication, thinking about language that called attention to itself, that kind of moved from a semiotic mode to a somatic, to call attention to the body. So this was a show that took place, was commissioned by Grand Union in Birmingham and travelled to Newcastle, New Bridge Project. It had a lot of new work by lots of young artists who were a similar generation to me. This is one work by Faye Nicholson and Oliver Smith. For the show, I had a marketing budget, and I thought, wouldn't it be more interesting to use a marketing budget to do a newspaper and you could make 4,000 or 5,000 newspapers and then give them out to universities and local spaces and use that as a platform for further new work. So within the newspaper, there's about 40 artists that made new work for that, people like Ruth Beale, Johan Ahrens, etc. And they created their own typeface that was based on an anecdote. I think he's a designer called David Carson, who was the head designer for Reagan magazine. And supposedly there was an interview with, I should know his name, Roxy Music, the guy who studied at Newcastle. What's his name? Brian Ferry, yeah. The interview was so boring. He thought, what I'm going to do is format it in wingbats so that nobody can read it. Well, you can read it if you kind of decoded the wingbats, but you'd have to sit there with a computer. So I was very interested in this kind of gesture of slowing down, of kind of like kind of making something much more opaque in terms of its transmission. And I was really interested in number stations at this time. So I don't know if you've heard about number stations. They were these kind of radio stations. They're still active around the world, and they just repeat numbers randomly. And supposedly there's an understanding that they were left over from the Cold War, and they're set up by the Russians to communicate to a network of spies. And it's very interesting, the idea that you could kind of speak to everybody, but your language is kind of encoded in such a way that only one or two people can actually understand you. You would need the kind of tools to decode the message. And we can think of this in terms of youth culture and other forms of kind of language. So with this kind of typeface, it was both in the newspaper, and these are Led Zeppelin lyrics, which was also in the press release. So there was a kind of way, if you kind of took long enough, you could decode the whole thing, but I don't think many people probably did. We also gave the typeface to a commercial gallery called Limoncello, and they used, we did an event where we launched the newspaper, and they would do their emails both in a kind of normal English and then this kind of wingbat format. And we gave out USB sticks with this wingbats typeface. So we were thinking about ideas around trust and ways of kind of disseminating the work that wasn't necessarily just within the gallery space. So the newspaper, the email. I mean, it's interesting going back to a show I did 5 years ago and kind of like you know, kind of I hadn't thought about for a while, and trying to kind of think about what my thinking was when I was putting this show together. So this is a work by Jeremy Hutchinson, where basically it's important that the work was hand-painted. It took 3 days. It was really difficult to do the D, to get the kind of curve right. Also, it's misspelt. So here we really like the idea of, like, A, the kind of invisible labour that goes into this kind of work, you know, B, this kind of affirmative gesture of, like, painting the whole wall with this definitely, but it's also like the most misspelt word in the English dictionary. So something that fatally undermines it as a word. And I should say at this time I was very interested in like a group of artists that were kind of, I would say, that are kind of native to the internet and social media, that were kind of using Twitter. Instagram wasn't very active at that time. It was mainly Twitter in really interesting ways in terms of like new forms of poetry, but also like using language where they would deliberately misspell words or use phonetic spelling. So I'm thinking of people like Harry Burke, Petra Cortright, Jessie Darling, and they would use the phonetic spelling of a word so it couldn't be mined by the algorithms. And I thought this was really interesting. So I was very interested in the idea of the monetization of kind of language and the kind of the financialization of terms. And this is the newspaper piled in on the floor here. This is the project in Newcastle at Newbridge Project. So it's some of the show changed quite radically, and some of it was similar work. Here we can see work by Erica Scorti. You can't really see the work itself, but basically there were love letters that she wrote to a boyfriend that had gone through a kind of process. It's a camera phone that transferred the text into a digital file back into analog. So there's again about ideas of mistranslation between the analog and the digital, to the point that these kind of words partially made sense and partially were just kind of became kind of melodic. Again, it's difficult because I mean, you can't really see it on this image, but this work here was by Jeremy Hutchinson, and these were supposedly he was looking on eBay and he realized there's a whole economy on eBay of objects that are very cheap because people misspell them, people can't find them. So again, it's dealing with the financialization of algorithms, you know, and I think what's interesting since this, in the last 5 years, this has become much more pronounced, right? Like the interfaces with technology are becoming much more vocal through Siri and Alexa, but also with Cambridge Analytica and the whole thing about data mining is just becoming a much bigger issue. So this was, I think, kind of really at the genesis of me thinking about algorithms and these sorts of ideas. So these were car bumpers that had been spelt car bummers and were for sale for a penny. So he would take the photograph offline and then frame it. So, like I say, I didn't really think. I didn't really see them as a trilogy of shows. But when I started the NGCA about 3 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago, I had a kind of 3 months to. There was a gap in the program, and Alistair, who was the director, said, "Have you got an idea?" So often what I do is I just do the opposite thing to what I did last time. So I thought, well, if a small hiccup is dealing with ideas of kind of language and misunderstanding, what would it mean to do a show around the body as a kind of semaphore? You know, like when we think of all of this meta-information of communication, of how we talk in terms of how we dress, from maybe the perfume we wear to the kind of gestural kind of way that we communicate. So we remove the words, what's happening here. So I became very interested in the idea of dance, choreography, but also diary writing and privacy. I became very interested in the idea that the diary as a kind of model of literature came out of the 17th century, a moment of kind of burgeoning colonialism in Britain, so a kind of moment where the middle classes were coming in, and the idea of ownership. So there was a relationship again to kind of personal language and ownership, which I thought was very interesting. But this was a project, solo exhibition by Joanna Petrowska, which is part of this Emotional Resources. Joanna is an artist I've worked with a number of times since she was a student. And probably her most famous work now is Faust, which is kind of untranslatable, but is about the idea of intimacy to the point that it becomes claustrophobic. So for the NGCA, she made a series of photographs based on self-defense manuals from the 70s, And then she works with her friends over 3 days to kind of enact these workshops that she documents. So we can see these images of her friend, this woman, sort of enacting these kind of self-defense gestures. So I was very interested. I think I wrote in the press release something along the lines of, when your words fail us, your body steps in, and vice versa. And I was very interested, again, in the idea of a politics beyond polemic. So not necessarily doing hectoring shows, but thinking about how we internalize types of politics on the body through gesture and through the voice. This is a work that kind of introduced the show by Daniel Lichtman, which is a fictionalized account of a teenage boy growing up in New York, written in Arial. So it's very interesting, again, in this notion of the diaristic, that it was completely it was written like a PowerPoint presentation, so removed all of the kind of meta-information of the language. And I was very interested in this highly emotive kind of language that used the kind of aesthetics of bureaucracy and what happened with these two kind of modes coming together, but also that kind of questioned the veracity of the kind of content. It's a work by Julius Koller, and this is a work that probably he made in the early 70s, where he would put ping pong tables in gallery spaces to kind of promote interpersonal interaction. So I was very interested in the way that the ping pong table operated in the show, as so the way that you needed two people to play it. So the idea of like intimacy, again, is this, Lauren Ballant talks about intimacy as being this kind of about equality between two people. So what happens when you slip out of that equality? In a game, there's always a winner and a loser. So I was very interested in how we can negotiate those positions politically, how we can be in a position where we disagree with someone but still be friends, right? Like, and also that it would enable the person, if they wanted the ping pong ball, they'd have to come and knock on the office door and talk to either me or Catherine. So it created a real opportunity to talk, like real language, rather than written language. Okay, I'll run through this. So again, kind of thinking around the body and a kind of removal and evacuation of language. I'm very interested in I'm doing a lot of research at the moment on feminist practice from the 70s and 80s, and how a lot of feminist poetry kind of tries to rethink language, because language is attached to a kind of patriarchal system. So people like Katie Le Roca, who's a very interesting artist that deals with gesture. So this is work by Renata Bertelmann, again, I think from the mid-70s, called Tender Touches, and they're blown up condoms that are kind of like touching each other. And this is work by Matthew Smith, which is bed sheets that have been rolled up and bleached pink. And this is a work that's actually speakers, and it's Marie Toseland work where she's describing the sound of swallowing. So there's a kind of, you have to stand really close to the wood to make sense of what's happening, but there's this kind of, you can hear something happening, but it's only articulated when you're really close to the work. Moira Davey. So Moira Davey is a photographer who takes photographs of her apartment and diaries, the kind of, again, all of the kind of notes within her old books, the kind of marginalia, and then literally prints the photograph and posts it to the gallery. So when it comes to the gallery, it's unfolded. So it bears the kind of marks of its transit. So it's very interesting, this kind of very personal address, kind of meeting the kind of global mechanisms of FedEx, in the kind of way that something would kind of like the personal and the public would meet. So the last show I'm going to talk about is These Rotten Words, and this was a show that I curated at Chapter Art Centre in Cardiff about a year ago. And I was invited by the head of exhibitions, Hannah Firth, to do a show around their annual festival. And the idea of the annual, I think the thematic for that festival is secret language. And I said, well, I've done these series of shows around language. It'd be quite nice to sort of complete them as a trilogy. And what's quite nice to talk about these shows is I've kind of moved on. I've kind of been thinking about different ways of approaching shows, and sort of thinking about ideas of decentering my own voice and working with artists in slightly different ways. So this sort of drew to a close this research, really. I wanted to show this because I have worked with numerous times Foundation Press, who are based here, who work with the foundation students in a kind of experimental publishing project. So this was a workshop what Adam Phillips did with his students to kind of create a logo for the show. And I was very interested in the way that we can kind of work with the students and treat them as a kind of in a similar way to the artists I was bringing in. So they came to Cardiff and did a residency for a week in the gallery space and did loads of projects and kind of enlivened the gallery space. This is so a performance by Marie-Michelle Deschamps, who's a French-Canadian artist, and she's done loads of work into Louise Wolfson, who was a kind of a theorist, scientist who was very interested. So he basically created a system for translating the English language into his own kind of phonetic language. He was also schizophrenic, so he was really he was kind of fearful of the English language. So when I met Marie and she was talking about her research, I was like, this really chimes with some of the things I was thinking about. And I guess it's her dealing with kind of ideas of translation. So this is kind of her, it's not her, but an actress performing these words, this kind of script that she's created in the space. So this is a work by Rebecca Ackroyd, again, Joanna Petraska. So often I try, with group shows, I often work with the same artists again and again and again, because I like to have this ongoing conversation and not just always start and stop conversations with artists, but kind of introduce new people into that ongoing conversation. So, you know, I was very interested in this show with, like, again, dealing with the body, but like estranging the body and sort of scaling it up and down. So hence these Rebecca's sculptures that kind of, these limbs, the kind of awkwardness of the limbs that came into the gallery space that were too big for the space, but also kind of framed other parts of the show. So this show was kind of really influenced by a photograph that I saw of a piece of graffiti from the 70s, and it said something along the lines of, "Words do not mean anything today." And I was really interested in this idea of anything. So I talked a lot, and it made me immediately think that, like, if words don't mean anything, they're like somehow they're rotten. And the idea of, I just liked the word rotten, and it made me think about the Sex Pistols and the idea of punk. And I thought, well, rottenness is also a kind of fertile space. Like, if something's rotten, things are coming out of it. So there's an opportunity for words to be kind of reassembled. This is also kind of the backdrop of this was kind of Brexit and Trump and thinking about post-truth, and how there was this article I read about politicians kind of divorcing words from their meaning, just sort of saying things, and because words operating as kind of like memes. So I was very interested in kind of like, well, how do we claim this space of language back? I should say that this record was a work by Annika Kampmann, where it was a kind of alternative soundtrack to the show, and it was dealing with the idea of her research into educational establishments and language, particularly the female voice in education. And we talked about how we would, like, we could have just played it as an audio file, but it was quite nice that it's as a record. So you would come in and you would be invited to play the record. So the record was a kind of, obviously it's something that degrades, it's entropic. So it's a physical thing like the body. And also you have to kind of engage it, you have to turn it on, and you go through this process with it. So this is something that I thought was very interesting in relation to the show. David Austin, who's a slightly older artist. So I'll just talk about these works here. So this was a work called End of Love, and I asked him to translate it into Welsh, because obviously it's happening in Cardiff. So he translated it into Welsh, but what I didn't know was that if the English one was a negative statement, the Welsh one was a positive statement. I can't remember what it said. I think it said love is eternal, or something like that. And also I asked, so he made 100 of them, and I asked the gallery assistant to give them out randomly, one a day, to people coming into the space. So I'm very interested sometimes as a curator, the idea of the gift and how we kind of, again, occupy, you know, because these as edition works, they'd probably be 150, 200 pounds, but I like the idea of just giving them away to people as a gift, and also them being in Welsh and English. And this is my last slide. So this is a work by Anna Barham, who was also in that show. And I just wanted to talk briefly about this. This is a film called Cicada, and this is a work that I've just re-shown in Newcastle University. And Anna's work is all about ideas of translation and the relationship between the digital and the analog, and the move between kind of speech to gesture to text. And the cicada, you know, like only the male cicada, like it's like a mating call. So she kind of remixed this kind of image of a cicada, which has been ground down and then made into a kind of 3D model. So this is a different kind of language in a way, but it's a kind of animal language that's beyond the human. So it's it's non-verbal. And I wanted to end with this because I thought it was a nice show to kind of start my fellowship at Newcastle University, because it's a kind of call to attention. What I liked about this is you could hear it in the foyer. So when you came into the university, if you didn't know where the gallery was, you just need to follow the noise. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. I think that's about my 20 minutes.
So, thank you. Sarah Giannini is an independent curator, writer, researcher, and semiotician. She's interested in pursuing, supporting, and facilitating crumbling categories, opacity, contradiction, fictional truth, linguistic performativity, and transvestism as a methodology. After her MA in semiotics from the University of Bologna, she worked as a curator, researcher and editor for the research programme Global Art and the Museum at ZKM Karlsruhe. And her long-term projects include the Volume Project in collaboration with 98 Weeks, the web publishing and archiving platform Unfold, and the independent curatorial agency Heterotropics. She's currently a tutor at the DAI Roaming Academy with the artist Pauline Kernia-Jarden and the Amsterdam organisation If I Can't Dance. Together with their students, they're working on the project Opera Corruption.
Hello. So let's see if this configuration works here with the paper and the PowerPoint. So as Laura said, having also a background in semiotics, I've been working a lot around kind of issues of language and art and performativity in a number of projects. I also did a project on misunderstanding, actually, so I was thinking about that. But I thought that since the theme of the evening is fictional encounters, I would talk about the encounter that I had with the archive and the work of René Daniels last year at the Van Abbe Museum. So for 1 year, I visited the archive as a research fellow of the Van Abbe Museum in the framework of the first edition of the Deviant Practice research program. And my initial idea was to approach and question this archive through notions of aphasic language. But then things also slightly changed over time. I will talk about that. And Daniel's work was the main trigger to kind of approach aphasia and aphasic language. In his paintings and drawings, like forms, colors, and actual words, are often disjointed from their functional semantics and behave aphasically. And in aphasic language, at least if we think about it metaphorically, words, when appear, are deviated from just transactional communication, and they acquire new meanings, multiple often, so very ambiguous, that are valid only in the contingency of their chaining, so in the present moment, and then they disappear again. Aphasic language, as much as Daniel's works, are non-understandable through traditional hermeneutics. So during my fellowship, I was interested in engaging with this non-understandable and experiment with another form of hermeneutics, one that would be outside of definitions and etiquettes, that would explore ways of relating rather than categorizing or defining, as is normal with archival practices. So I'd like now to maybe give an introduction on Daniel's work, because you may not be familiar with it. So Daniels is a visual artist based in Eindhoven, where he was born in 1950. He was mainly active for 10 years between the late 70s and early 80s. And despite this kind of relative short amount of time, he's considered today one of the most inspiring and influential artists of his generation. In the after like a short period in which he would paint gramophones and records and libraries in a kind of expressionist style, in the late 70s and early 80s, Daniel starts researching kind of ironic and subtle interplays between images and words that will eventually lead to so these are like examples of like these early works that would lead to the so-called Spring Blossom, that was like one of the last works that he produced in '87. Here you can see that words appear on this tree or urban plan, and they're often very cryptical. So Daniels called this research trajectory a form of visual poetry, and I'm quoting here, in that former no man's land between literature, visual art, and life. As a great admirer of Duchamp, Picabia, and Brothers, he would come up often with puns, visual puns and linguistic puns, but also distortions, invented words. And the meaning of these enigmatic works is always very ambiguous, suspended, and open, as the series of the two eyes fighting over one dot suggests. So these paintings really visualize the direction of Daniel's artistic research, I think. The series reminds us that identity, the I, is neither identical nor singular, but uneven, and that consequently the signifier and the signified are unhooked and searching for one another. Over the years, Daniels loosens the symbolic or figurative tone of the first paintings and ventures into a more diagrammatic language. In '84, he paints for the first time what very quickly became his trademark, the schematic image of a space in perspective that most of the people know as the bow tie, but also sometimes perceivable as a human figure, like here, and much more often as an exhibition space with windows, doors, and paintings. So these paintings, the bow ties, could be considered as units in interconnection. So Daniels repeats and manipulates these diagrams, elaborating a meta-discourse on representation. So in semiotic terms, these units trigger a chain of interpretants that runs on the surface of signification without falling in the depths of meaning, so without really stopping to have like one precise meaning. The bow tie is a sign that is semiotized through infinite signs, as if in a state of hallucinatory wandering. One painting leads to another painting, which leads to a drawing, which leads to a note, which leads to a word or a title, and a thought in the mind of the viewer, and so on. So, and the interconnection of figurations occurs not only among more paintings, but also within the same one through the technique of the fleece. The fleece is a term that Daniels kind of coined or like invented himself. I'm not sure if it really exists in English. Like he would say that it's like the translucent effect of the candy wrapper. So like holding a candy wrapper in front of your eyes, that's the fleece. So he would layer the canvas through subsequent strata of semi-transparent color, so that one painting is not singular but plural, and transparency is turned into opacity. Daniels then used to work on his paintings layer after layer, even after having exhibited them. He would change their titles too, avoiding the trap of definition and finitude, and pushing more radically what he was already doing with the bow tie itself. So in this sense, every Daniels is potentially untitled and unfinished. His work is really radically open to interpretation, but also to infinite rework, renaming, and transformation. In an interview that was released in '83, Daniels stated, "The art world is afflicted by a disease that is characteristic of the times, art historians interfering with art. The result is that the interpretation becomes too much unambiguous, so that a label can be put on you as quickly as possible. I oppose that. What I don't want is becoming increasingly clear. And in the midst of a great international success in '87, at the age of 37, Daniels was struck by a severe brain stroke, which left him physically challenged and without the use of speech at all. After this terrible accident, most of those found at his studio went into the care of the newly established René Daniels Foundation. And at the request of the foundation, the Fanabe Museum cataloged, documented, and archived the almost 1,000 drawings, sketches, notes, and paintings that were in the studio, and that now form the René Daniels archive, which I worked with. So the year '87 became a straight demarcation line in the narrative surrounding Daniels' life and work, which is now split between a before and an after. So the trope of the rapture satisfies the archival imperative to be complete and definitive, to create regions of authenticity, to distinguish between the known and the unknown, the mutable and the mutable, the past and the future. However, like all archives, also this one is only superficially homogeneous and coherent because it contains a lot of untitled, undated, and unfinished materials, which for their, let's say, undetermined status have never been shown, or if they have triggered quite some questions over their legitimacy. But what is interesting, as I said earlier, is that Daniels was very aware of the fact that, in a way, the art world doesn't know how to cope very well with slippery matter because it normally lies on the production of identity as value. And with his kind of idea of the open work, the rework, the renaming, he was already making the kind of discrimination between finished and unfinished, titled and untitled, not irrelevant, but at least like more complicated than what it would seem. So the constitution of the archive promoted a process of historization, definition, and canonization of Daniels' work, actualizing in a way like his fears of being clear. So the archive, of course, was created to preserve and protect Daniels' legacy, but to do so, it had to simulate his death, his artistic death. And this is, I think, like the archival paradox, so the tension between death and the promise of immortality. The filmmaker Mariam Ghani, talking about this paradox, says, when a collection becomes an archive, the linguistic shift registers a transformation from a group of objects that are to a group of objects that were. In this sense, the archive is founded on a moment of passing into the past, a kind of death. The need to archive is connected to the fear of loss, but to archive something, it must be fixed in time, like a butterfly pinned in a glass case, and thus to archive is to kill the very thing you feared to lose. Sorry, I skipped, yeah. So with my research, I wanted to approach the Daniels archive not as a corpse, but more as a living body, as a corpus. And that's also why, at some point, I stopped visiting the archive and I started visiting René Daniels himself. And when I started to do so, I was confronted with another huge blind spot, that is the new. So the huge library of sketchbooks full of new drawings that are closed in the closets of his apartment. Falling out of the time frame of '87, these works are not in the archive and they have not a clear value. They're also pretty much unknown. But are they less authentic René Daniels as most of the people think? After being neglected for many years, the Fanabe Museum recently has acquired 2 paintings that were produced after '87. Even though painting is no longer like Daniels' medium, also for like physical reasons, but he's drawing now. But these paintings that have been shown also somewhere, in other venues, are normally presented as a kind of a small appendix to the real body of work. And as far as back as '98, still no one knew how seriously to take these new works because they lack the intensity and consistency of the Evre as we know it. And this was a spokesman of the Fanabe Museum at the time. But I think it's kind of interesting that for the work of an artist to be the work of that artist or to be considered art, it should correspond to like certain fixed categories such as intensity and consistency. Whereas we know that interpretation and judgment are always conditioned by time and space. Art that is made now may or may not resonate with humans or non-humans in 50, 100, and 1,000 years. And this is also like what Daniels, I think, was trying to do. So like showing that discourse never belongs to the speaking subject, but is always based on unknown languages, as the title of a very famous painting says. Anyway, at some point, I found this drawing in the archive. A sort of message from the past or maybe from the future. In the drawing, you can see the words old and new are first separated by a line, which could be the rapture, I don't know, and later meet within a texture of bricks. And this encounter was really, mind-blowing, and it changed a lot of it changed the direction the research was taking. And I really thought that my aim, my mission was like to reconnect the old and new and also question chronological time. I started reading about time entanglement and quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, basically a group of particles are said to be entangled when they are correlated in their properties. What happens to one affects the other, even across space, and now they're speculating this correlation across time. So not only according to, thinking through the theory of time entanglement, not only can two events be correlated, but they can become correlated such that it becomes impossible to say what is earlier and what is later. Each is the cause of the other across past and future. If we think through this idea of time entanglement, there is no predetermination, so it's not the past that determines the future, but a continuous co-determination in the now, which is the only time that really exists. What is also fascinating, according to this theory, is that it is the simple observation or measurement of the particle that causes the transformation in a correlated field. So the transformational power of observation seems in a way to corroborate the idea of infinite semiosis, for which interpretation can change the past by looking at it in different ways. After the stroke, many critics have noticed how paradoxical is the fact that for an artist that looked for this searched ambiguity and mystery, he then ended up being completely silent. But then, I dare to pose a different question, an inverted question. What if Daniels' theory of the unfinished and his misuse of language have instead been co-produced by the future Daniels? What if the future has already happened? What if the new and the old are being co-determined, like the drawing was showing? So this co-determination is the base of the curatorial project On Now, René Daniels, that I curated at the Fanabi Museum in the summer last year. And that unfolded through a series of performative encounters, let's say, and an exhibition. So this is an exhibition view. This also. So I created constellations of drawings through the future. I said that the future provided me with the right tools to stab the archive, to open and unpack the archive, and rescue the past from death. So I created these constellations of old and new drawings without using captions, dates, titles, nor a given linearity. One could just follow the kind of Daniels manipulation of language, time, and space. And then I also added a selection of paintings from the archive. The constellations, the exhibition was the base for a performative intervention, which I scripted together with two artists, Mercedes Azpilicueta and Stav Yaini. Together, we experimented with a language that would not explain, label, or dissect the works, but with a sort of anti-language that would relate and play with Daniel's works. Mercedes is a visual artist, performer, and visual artist, performer, and poet who works primarily with the voice, while Stavia Ine is a dancer and also a Reiki practitioner. And so she blends dance with the activation of different senses. The intervention consisted in a series of 9 one-to-one sessions, closed sessions, so there was no public, with people who have a peculiar relationship to language. And we made an open call to find these participants. And to prepare the open call was quite important, was quite a delicate moment, because we didn't want to, it was a project about escaping the label, so we didn't want to label the people that would come to participate to our performances. And so we tried to use a language that was also like ambiguous and generous and could host different individuals. That's an excerpt of the open call. Also, like, we didn't really know how to name these performances, and we still don't have like a name for it. It was something in between a workshop and a performance and a guide. But it was really important to have a space of no expectation that was devoid of utility and finality and projection. So during the encounters, we experienced different and non-normative relations to language, starting from the exhibition. So the drawings and the paintings functioned as a script, while each performance varied enormously with every guest, depending on their bodies, needs, desires, moods, voices. And so each session became a very charged performative universe, also because there was no public, there was no outside. Everything that entered the universe was part of the performance and was transformed by the performance. Every step, sound, or gesture became part of this language and also acquiring like a symbolic meaning and a symbolic connotation. The language I think we were aspiring to has an affinity with glossolalia, or the idea of speaking in tongues, a phenomenon in which people appear to speak in languages unknown to them. Such speeches lack any codified meaning, and they're often at the core of religious practices. The French philosopher Michel de Certeau wrote quite extensively on glossolalia, and he defined it as the voice that possesses discourse, as a wild voice beyond meaning and truth that is then normalized by interpretation. In this sense, glossolalia reclaims the potentiality to speak within the apparatus that governs and distributes speech and its modalities. With our sessions, we attempted at infiltrating a space of pure vocality and enunciation within the folds of official discourse, like the museum and the archive. And that was outside really the jurisdiction of codes, interpretation, and history. We were really inspired by the writings of the radical psychiatric Fernand Deligny, who from the 50s onwards moved to the Pyrenees in France and started to live with autistic children and adolescents. And he rejected to force the non-speaking autistics to standards of speech. Instead, they sought to develop a practice that would exclude interpretation and code, so that, and this is a quote, the remainder resistant to any comprehension might emerge. Deligny opposed language as a bearer of sense and finality. To allow for the evacuation of sense, Deligny started to focus on tracing the free trajectories that the children would undertake during the day, and he called these wonder lines. So like he basically left the children wandering around without giving them direction. And he and his collaborators were like drawing this kind of wonder lines. The cartographic tracing became the epicenter of the group's activities, and there was no attempt to regulate their movements or to explain them. Inspired by Deligny, together with our guests, we wandered across space, language, and time, thinking also about the interesting correspondence between the idea of chronological time, so the arrow, which is a predetermined direction, and writing and language, and how language is the keeper of time and time is the keeper of language. There is no language as such outside of time, chronological time. There is no time outside of language. So in this sense, the idea of wandering is also the idea of like unpacking, you know, chronological time and I don't know, coded language. During the sessions, we then invited our guests to trace their wander lines, and we asked them also to pay attention to the visualization of time through space and vice versa. Yeah, these are the maps, and they are the only record of the performances. We didn't document them or record them. And they're so like a kind of postscript of the performance, but also they could be considered a kind of a translational and opaque archive record document of the drawings that were, of the works that were in display. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Dawn Bothwell. As already mentioned, Dawn works with Circa projects and also the projects based in Northern Charter. She's a PhD researcher with the Curatorial Resource for Upstart Media Bliss, or CRUM, at the University of Sunderland, and she's a musician of various projects including Pentecostal Party and Hen Ogledd.
Okay, thanks Laura, and thanks Sarah and George. Really interesting to hear about your work. Yeah, so I do a few things, but I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about some work that I have made with Circa Projects, who are a curatorial organisation based in the Northeast. We don't have like a project space or a gallery, but we work with different partners, different organisations, locations across different formats to produce work. And I guess we call ourselves a curatorial organisation because we would see our work as kind of existing in that intersection, like within that dialogue that happens between us, myself, Adam Phillips and Sam Watson, that I run Circa Projects with, and our partners and the artists that we invite into a conversation. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about a project that we made in 2014 to 15, which is called Public. And Public sort of came out of the situation that we found ourselves in, I guess looking around at the sort of arts ecology within the region, but also, I guess, across the country. There are a lot of arts organisations popping up due to like the availability of space, especially like empty commercial spaces. And, you know, obviously that is a good thing. Like, you know, it's birthed a lot of new arts organisations, but I guess the flip side to that is that it's maybe not like the most sustainable model. So we found ourselves asking, you know, what sort of spaces or like community spaces or social spaces exist with a more sustainable model. Because the new spaces around us were kind of like with not even holding like a leasehold in the space, we found ourselves asking, you know, what spaces have like actually have the freehold on their premises, which means they can't be turfed out by property owners or landlords. And we decided to produce 3 projects across 3 different spaces that had a freehold on their premises. They were all like very different examples, I guess. Maybe some of them even seem problematic, but we decided it would be interesting to produce some work there. So yeah, the first project that we produced was in July 2014, and it was called Instructions for Unwelcome Tables. It was held in the Union Rooms, which is a Wetherspoons pub in Newcastle. And yeah, we kind of thought it would be interesting to produce a work with the artist David Steens there, because he was speaking to us about producing these new works of fiction, and I guess kind of dwelling on Wetherspoons, you know, they primarily are a space for like dialogue, I guess, in a way, like casual dialogue. They don't play any music. They have a policy of not playing music in the pub, so that can happen there. So we started to kind of look at things like, you know, thinking about reading groups and writers groups that meet up in pubs. So the event was basically that David had written this story, which was about two party planners, and they were planning a party in quite a prestigious hotel. And the piece kind of like goes between them on the opening night, and they start to kind of wonder about what they would do with like undesirable people that might show up to the party. So it's kind of about that. I'll read you a quick section of the story and also hand you some books. Yep, so this is just an excerpt towards the end of the book. "Well," said Callum, "tonight is the night. Tonight commences in a few hours. For the sake of argument, how in future would you better prepare against or arrange around your so-called unwelcome tables? I suppose you could strategically seat the unwelcome tables so as to have them positioned as far away as possible from the other guests. I suppose you could do that, yes, but wouldn't it be a bit obvious? And wouldn't unwelcome tables full of undesirables, naturally suspicious, be likely to take this issue up with you, the party organiser? Aren't they likely to complain loudly about the awful seats in which you've sat them? And aren't they likely in doing so to create an unpleasant scene, even more so unpleasant than the scene you hoped to avoid by placing them over there in the first place? The table legs, after shedding layers of varnished wood, rudely inserted themselves into orifices. The surfaces and the limbs of the tables melded with those of the party organisers. Each tabletop enveloped its respective party organiser's chest. Callum and Joe's rib cages spread open into slats over their respective tables. What had been the left and right buttock of each party organiser was relocated around a corner of each table vaguely. Each organiser's left and right shoulder blades likewise formed the remaining corners of the tabletop, so that the tables, though square, had a front and back. Callum and Joe were subsumed into the two tables that they had been sitting upon. Callum was now a table, and Joe was now a table. These two new tables, after having subsumed each party organiser, were of an awkward and ugly aspect. The two tables could not help but realise how this would affect their standing in the party this evening. They could not speak, they had no faces, their clothes were ill-fitting, and their disposition was mean, soured by the extreme discomfort this unexpected transmutation caused. The two newly unwelcome tables, not wanting to join the party and doing so meant ruining it, shuffled over to unassuming corners of the opposite sides of the Highland Lounge and gloomily awaited the guests. So the party organisers became unwelcome tables. So yeah, here are some images from inside during the reading. Okay, the second project that I'd like to talk about as part of Public was called GIG. It took place at St. Peter's Social Club, which is a social club in Byker, and it was established in 1756, so I think it's the oldest social club in Newcastle. So just a little bit of information about the social club itself. Like others across the country, it was initially a philanthropic venture. Individuals in the local community grouped together and purchased land and commissioned the social club building, giving the club an autonomy that safeguarded its long-term success. It was originally a Liberal Party club, and Liberal Party clubs such as this one were an important part of the working men's club movement of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Although many of these clubs have now lost their political message, at one point they were radical and about positive social change and equality through education. So these kind of messages, these political messages, were carried within the clubs from person to person. So again, we were kind of interested in that kind of function, the social function of the club as a space for conversation and transferring information in that way. So the event called Gig that Circa curated there, we worked together with curator Rosie Cooper, artists Will Cobbing, Rodri Davies and Hugh Metcalfe. And we invited performers that evening, Rodri Davies, Hugh Metcalfe and Noise Choir. And the evening aimed to honour the sound artist Bob Cobbing. So particularly Bob Cobbing organised and performed informal gatherings until his death that took place in pubs and social clubs across London. And the evenings often featured film, music, poetry and workshops. And they continued the intense energy that characterised Cobbing's early career as a prolific publisher and organiser, setting up the London Filmmakers Co-op, establishing Better Books, running Writers' Forum, and Better Books itself as one of the leading avant-garde performance spaces in 60s London. So we invited Hugh Metcalfe because he was a long-term collaborator with Bob Cobbing. They had a band together called Bird Yak, and Hugh Metcalfe himself still organises improvisers' nights across London in similar spaces like social clubs and pubs called The Clinker. And we invited Rodri Davies, who's a harp and percussion improviser, because he's a long-standing fan of Bob Cobbing, and Noise Choir. To give a little colour to Cobbing's works, for those of you who don't know his work, I'll read you a quote from him from his publication, The Ballet of the Speech Organs. When the reading of those words takes place, one pays attention to the blurring and the distortions, etc., and uses one's voice in a blurred and distorted way. And having blurred the words almost out of existence, one then begins to wonder, does one need the word? Is there not a sign language which relies upon lines, shapes, and textures of which words are a part? But words are not the whole of it. The shape, the mark on the page, is the significant thing. And any mark or shape on the page, any texture can be read, can be interpreted as sound. So I'd like to play you a quick video clip of one of the performances that evening, which was an interpretation of a score called Sensations of the Retina. If you just give me a second, I'll switch to video. Can you help me with your track practicing? It's just that one that says my passport. Choose. And then Rodri Retina. That one there. Hold on. Okay, so that was Rodri Davies performing this score that we see in front of us, called Sensations of the Retina. As you can see, like, the idea is that the performer themselves kind of take on responsibility for the score. So instead of like a musician composing an idea and having like a strict sort of sense of what they want the performer to do, they produce something that's loose enough for the performer to be able to interpret it in their own way. Yeah. And this was another score that you can't quite see. I think I'll just skip it. Okay. And this is Noise Choir performing a piece there on stage. So you can see there's a lovely lammy curtain in the background. Okay, so the last project that I'll talk to you about as part of the public series was called GIF Gaff. And that took place in the Palace Green Pavilion in Berwick, and it was hosted by Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival. So GIF Gaff, most people know it as like a mobile phone operator, but a few people know that it's actually an old Brythonic Northumberland language word, which means to give and take in either talking or in a helpful way of mutual assistance. So that's kind of like the closest interpretation, because obviously the word doesn't have like a straightforward interpretation. But yes, I guess we could kind of even take it to mean something like conversation or banter, like this idea of like a mutual exchange and sympathy for each other. So this kind of brought us to look at the social role of language, and to think about what it does rather than sort of direct facts. We also wanted to produce this project that brought in kind of like mixed personal experiences, and within doing that, like mixed together fact and non-fiction, and even maybe like similar to, as you could see with Rodri's performance there, moving away from language into sound. So GIF Gaff took place over 2 nights in the Palace Green Pavilion. Also, I forgot to mention the Palace Green Pavilion itself was formerly a scout hall originally, and it's so yeah, again, another place for a kind of conversation or passing of instruction to sort of from scout leaders to scouts. So on the first night of GIF Gaff, we held an event, and the first part of that was that we wanted to put an advert out to the local community around Berwick. So we placed an ad in the Berwick Advertiser, and it's the ad in the middle here, where it says "Wanted Enigmatic Storytellers." And we kind of just welcomed local people who were storytellers in any sense, whether they were working with fiction or non-fiction, to come forward and, yeah, like they could present something for a kind of maximum space of 10 minutes in the first evening. And this is one of the presentations there. The thing is, like, what we did in the evening was we kind of put these presentations together, but we didn't tell anyone what was fact and what was fiction. So you ended up with this kind of ongoing, you know, set of presentations where, like, the viewer, the audience was kind of like moved into this kind of surreal headspace of not knowing like what was real and not real, which was quite, yeah, it was quite nice. The other part of that evening, we invited back Rodri Davies. The reason for that was kind of like to develop his own kind of interest, and he's really interested in the first ever poem that was made in the Northumberland area, which is called Y Gododin, which was a work that was developed in like Brythonic times. But the interesting thing about the poem is that you can kind of consider it a Welsh poem or a Northumbrian poem, because at that point the Welsh language was used in this part of the country. And Rodri himself is Welsh, and he's kind of interested in the slippages between that. So yeah, Rodri decided to record his own daughter, Ethiw, who was brought up in her early years in the northeast, but speaks Welsh, because he was very particular about wanting someone to read Y Gododdin that had like a Northumbrian accent but could speak the Welsh language. So he played a recording of her, and then he played a recording of Basil Bunting's Brig Flats, a section of that piece which mentions Y Gododdin, which brings it into modern literature. And then he presented us with this harp which he had made, which is actually strung with horse hair, which was the original technique at that time. And the poem Y Gododdin mentions the harp and the horsehair strung harp at that point. And he then performed an improvised piece on the harp for us. So again, this kind of brought back together this kind of connection between music and poetry at that time. On the second night, it was kind of more pushing it into the vein of music, but kind of music which used spoken words, and especially focusing on kind of like personal accounts and surreal accounts of life. So this is a performance by Gummy Stumps. And the evening ended with a short story that was written by Bedwer Williams, which was about a restaurant, a kind of yuppie restaurant that was inside a building that was the shape of a tagine, which exploded and everybody died inside the restaurant, and he was holding the only remaining artifact, which was this wooden spoon, which was a table number. I'm just going to play you a quick video to end on that I have of one of the performances. Okay, I'll finish there with Zanpaster Brothers, who were performing a conversation that Christo, the singer, had and with a rural taxi driver who had become disillusioned and disaffected. Thanks.
So thank you, everyone, for your presentations. I have maybe 3 things I want to say that aren't questions as such, but observations, and maybe they can start off a conversation. So the first thing I found really interesting that I think is across each of your presentations is this idea of the productivity of misunderstanding. So whether that's within sort of Rene Daniel saying he doesn't want to become increasingly clear, to a misunderstanding that maybe can result in a humour or also a blurring of truth and fiction. So thinking about that misunderstanding and where that comes from, and the sort of potential in the idea of divorcing the signifier from the signified. So suspending language from its role as an instrument of communication. And the ability for that to bring with it both a more dynamic sort of viewing position on a particular subject and also a possible critique of that subject.
Ta-da. Well, I don't know, like, what you said during your presentation, George, about post-truth, the post-truth world in which we find ourselves is something that is kind of puzzling me as a person who has always been quite a post-truth one. I think it's quite uncanny, the fact that power systems and institutions are championing kind of post-truth, or like the divorce of the signifier and the signified, or like being increasingly clear, or like our fiction. I think, in a way, like these were, I think there still are like the realms of art, experimentation, poetry, and really like researching like different ways of being in the world. And in a way, I think maybe we are living in a moment of cannibalization of certain practices by like I don't know, political discourse or official discourse, and I think that's something that is worth thinking about a lot. I mean, I don't know, I don't have any answer. I don't know. I just feel that there is this kind of appropriation of this perspective, of the misunderstanding. For now, I think that's it.
I think there's a couple of things. I think we think about the institution of the museum historically being as a space that confers legitimacy and authority. I always think of my job as a curator to undermine that in some way and to question it. And also to say that confusion is okay, that the space of not knowing is okay. But when you were talking, I was thinking, when you were talking about political authority, it just reminded me of an anecdote of when I was working with an artist once, and this shift from first to third person. She wanted very much the wall label to be spoken, to have the kind of the tone of authority and the tone of the institution. So it wasn't her speaking; it wasn't a subjective opinion; it was fact, and that was quite important at that point. So I guess it's trying to understand when to use different sorts of linguistic strategies to either undermine, also to advocate. But one word I always return to within institutions is polyphony, and thinking about different voices that can come through. Obviously, there's my voice as the curator, but I speak from a very particular position in terms of my gender, in terms of where I'm from, my age, class. So understanding when to let other people speak and other people's linguistic strategies. If we see myself as in some way operating from, when I was talking about major and minor languages, I'm very interested in those as strategies, how we think of the minor curatorial strategies as ways of kind of like being against the mainstream or the hegemonic way of operating. Taking it in turns.
Was there a lead?
Okay, I'll lean over a little bit. I guess sort of in agreement with George as well, but I guess I'm thinking also about like non-institutional spaces and how fiction can be used as a kind of method for maybe going into spaces and not looking like an art tourist, like not going in and kind of like, to just stare at something, but instead to occupy like an imaginative space or a creative space, and do something else while you're there. So say, for instance, with our event at Weatherspoons, it could have been quite a different event if we'd just invited everybody in to have a discussion on, you know, the ethics of Weatherspoons and like, you know, the good and bad things that come out of that business. But we didn't do that. We invited someone to share a piece of creative writing, which I guess in itself, like, you know, the ideas contained within the work were kind of polarizing this idea of like a prestigious venue and who's desirable and undesirable alongside a venue which has a policy. Well, I don't think it has a dress code. I think it does have a code. It's something like you have to wear clothes inside and shoes, but it doesn't have a proper dress code. So like, you know, it's kind of, you know, it did have an element of criticality to it, but at the same time it had enough distance through that fiction to not antagonize in that way.
I don't know, you said you had 3.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear them.
Well, the other thing I think picks up on what you're both saying about these alternative voices or other possible sort of linguistic forms to consider when you're thinking about the exhibition, like your project with the archive, the workshops or sessions you held, and also to think about how language, so I suppose speaking with people who don't speak the same language as us, and in particular made me think about Alfonso Lingus and his sort of community of the dying, whereas if someone's dying, you don't talk to them with a specific, there's no, you know, nothing needs to be said, but you still will keep talking. And that sort of means of almost call and response of language, and the place of that, I suppose, as a form of communicating beyond meaning or messages.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Like in the performances that we organized, it was really magical to see how like we could communicate or share something that was really like, I don't know, the sound of the steps or like little details, like of course like sonic details in the room, or how we would use our tongues to produce certain sounds, and how from that we would build up a shared language together, like definitely a minor language, not a language, hegemonic language, not a codified language, but something totally deviant. And for me, it was really quite important, and I mean, quite, I don't know, wonderful to see that it was possible just to do that with a person that steps in with quite a complex life and background. I don't know, we had a person with schizophrenic problems, aphasic people, and we would just start doing this. Of course, I mean, Mercedes and staff are really amazing, amazing performers. Without them, it wouldn't have been possible. But yeah, no, it was quite magical to be able to experience this. Of course, it's the body. I mean, it's also the language of the body and gestures, and that is, I mean, I think often ignored.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how these two projects, the way that Circa projects operate, these informal kind of workshops that operate not against the institution, but sort of counter to the institution, but also performativity. And I think over the last 5 years, the increased programming around choreography within gallery spaces and performance, you know, the Tank galleries at Tate Modern being an example, being a kind of a renewed interest in the body at a moment of where, you know, online activity, smartphones, dematerialization of language, but also the constant demand that social media makes on people to articulate through, whether it be a certain amount of characters or... so I think there's interesting that at that time of where the smartphone became really popular, that you see these kind of, I think, turns in the art world to the kind of intimacy of bodies in spaces, whether that's in a workshop or in a gallery space through dance. So I think this is something that I've kind of seen over the last 10 years.
Maybe I'll ask the audience, does anyone have any questions? Or any comments?
Provocations.
Yeah, that was really interesting in lots of different ways. And I was just wondering about the polyphonic kind of idea, because it's a phrase that I've heard quite a lot recently. But also what you speak about is kind of looking at the subjective voice within a sea of subjective voices. It's quite hard to distinguish between one voice and another voice. And obviously in the context of what is the truth kind of thing. So I suppose I'm kind of trying to unpick what, as people who create exhibitions or projects that the public can participate in, how do you manage those encounters? Because I think the personal encounter is always going to be very personal, and how do you share that in the public space? I suppose the connection between private and public, and how you engage with the polyphonic in that way. Are we on trend with that? I suppose. God, sorry. It's not really a question. It's kind of after a very long day of looking at art, it's more like a train of thought, really. But I don't know if you can kind of explain a bit more about polyphonic.
But it's interesting because it makes perfect sense. Actually, I was doing a talk about 4 or 5 months ago, talking about the future, radical futures, and nobody could agree on what the term radical meant and what the term future meant. So there's no shared vision for the future, and it's something that comes up a lot in Adam Curtis's work. Like, his criticism is the tyranny of our age is the obsession with the self, and that the left have to find new kind of narratives around collective action and collective voice, and it's difficult. It's a big topic, isn't it? That's probably not necessarily right for this context, but I think it's interesting in relation to a specific example. So, the occupation movement 6-7 years ago being about a polyphony of different voices. It wasn't really about a particular thing. It was just about claiming public space through the body. But then recently, working in a university, the teacher strikes. That's about something very, very specific as a collective thing that people can congregate around. But I don't know, I also think that within the art world and exhibition making, there's certain thematics that come up. Like I say, 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot around language. I think that, it's the end of a long day for me as well. I'm not sure about other trends, but I don't know if other people want to come in on that. Personally, I find the idea of the collective voice really troubling, to be coerced within a collective voice. But I don't know whether that's about my own biography, perhaps, as well. Certainly, I always think about this term of the dissensus, that we can be in a space of disagreement but be together. So it's more like thinking through Chantal Mouffe and the idea of the political space being around the idea of dissensus. That, for me, is a much more interesting concept.
I think I've also like a troubled relationship with the idea of like collectivity or like the commons, or like thinking of homogeneous groups as having like a homogeneous voice. So that's why I think that the term polyphony that implicates a diversity of voices is interesting. But maybe like what interests me more is like to think about the polyphony that exists within ourselves. So that start undermining the idea that we are a singularity somehow, but we are already like universes of contradictions. There's this amazing, it's from a movie by Manthia Diawara. It's like an interview by Manthia Diawara with Edouard Glissant, amazing Martinique philosopher, who wrote extensively on the idea of opacity, on our right to be opaque and not transparent. And in this interview, at some point, he says, well, you know, like, everybody loves broccoli, but I hate broccoli. Do I know why? No, actually. I don't know why. There is some part of myself that is opaque to myself. So like I cannot claim any ownership or authorship towards this feeling of not liking broccoli. So what should we want or believe that we can know the others? There is this unknown within us, and I think that maybe it's from this unknown that we should start.
I think as well in relation to that, it makes me think of, I was recently at like a film weekend. There's a festival here called AV Festival, and they were focusing on the works of the filmmaker Raoul Roos. And George Clark, who is really interested in his work, was talking about it and saying, you know, that he would like, the thing with Raoul Roos was that, you know, he was in Chile and then kind of left after Pinochet, but he wouldn't confirm that he was asked to leave the country. He would kind of make up stories, like he would say, oh yeah, I was already in France working on a film then. Like, and then you have to think, considering this, you know, the political content of his films, why he didn't like take a position to say this, confirm the story this way or that way. But what not confirming that position did was it allowed him to kind of mobilize himself in a position where he could be somewhere that he would be supported to say what he wanted to say. So that idea, I guess I'm just thinking in relation to what you're saying of opacity, is that like you can be in this kind of in-between position, you know, and sometimes in that in-between position you're actually more mobile than if you're completely transparent.
No, I've got nothing to add to that. I think it's a good response. You had another.
One more. Yeah. But I think that idea of opacity, like within yourself, and that acknowledging that in relation to how you cannot know fully the other, is a really kind of productive thing, or like a productive take, particularly at this moment of this fake news or the collective voice, and yeah. So maybe that's a good thing to end on. Yeah. Do you want to say something? Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much for this evening's presentations. The next event in the series of discussions will be at the Grundy Art Gallery at the end of July, and it takes a theme of staging and film sets, looking at artists who are producing film works and installations. And there's a visiting speaker, Annika Wick from Stockholm, who uses film theory to approach installation-based practices. But there'll be more information on the website.